Welcome to Gever.com, where the wise get wiser. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the seventh letter of the Hebrew Bible. And of course, we're going to look at a few key words, one of which is the word meaning to remember. And that's a very important concept in the Bible, of course, both from God and from humans, that we remember and God remembers. So important. We're also going to look at two really important verses. One from Genesis 1, where it talks about we are made in the image of God. And then also from Psalm 105, which talks about how God is faithful and remembers his covenants. So let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with talking about our letter Zayin, the seventh letter, and of course, starting with a little bit of review with our alphabet. So let's begin here with our alphabet, and hopefully this is beginning to feel a little more comfortable, and you can probably do it with me or maybe even just pause and do it yourself. But let's go through it a little quick, and then we'll do it slowly. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, good. Well, let's go through it a little bit slower. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Tzade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, great. So let's do it one more time quickly. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that is our Hebrew alphabet. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the seventh letter here, called the Zayin. Zayin. And we can talk about the form of it here first. So how is it written? Of course, I always recommend taking a piece of paper and a pen or pencil and actually doing this. This is the best way to learn. So within our space between the lines here, you will just make one stroke vertical, very similar to the Vav. However, the Zayin is unique in that there is a very important piece on the top here, okay? So it's a little bit diagonal actually, so it's not nice and straight along the top, but it is a little bit of a diagonal line at the top here. I like to call it its hat, the little hat that it wears, okay? So you have this straight line that fills most of the space, and then you have this little hat that's kind of diagonal on the top there. All right. So pretty simple, but practice writing that a few times, kind of get the idea. And now let's look at a few different variations of the types of fonts that you might see. Well, this is sort of the more biblical font style. Okay, of course, you see this is a very prominent top part. Kind of almost looks like a little mushroom or something, I think, personally. All right, but a little bit more simplified form here. And again, another very similar form here. This one is a little bit more straight rather than diagonal. Well, let's look at some of the early forms of this. Well, in ancient times, the Proto-Sinaitic, remember again from about the time of the Judges to perhaps Abraham, it was typically either like this, with just sort of two parallel lines, as you see here, or sometimes it was also kind of written like this. So even in early times and throughout the Paleo-Hebrew period as well, it was either two parallel lines like this, horizontal, with a dash in between it, or without it, like we see here. Okay. But again, in our more modern Babylonian square script version, they kind of just simplified it, right? And they left off this bottom piece, right? And you get left with just this middle and the top piece. What's interesting, though, is ancient Greek, again, remember, was derived and built off of the ancient Phoenician letters and forms, which were also the same as essentially the Paleo-Hebrew. Well, the equivalent letter, the zeta in the ancient Greek, as you can see here, is just like our English Z. And so you can actually see how it would have been derived from our early Paleo-Hebrew form, right? Just with a little bit more of a diagonal line here instead of a vertical line. And again, similarly, in our later Hebrew, they simply have the sort of vertical line and just the top piece, and they sort of simplified or got rid of that bottom piece. But you can see how it was derived. Well, just like the Z in English, the Zayin is that Z sound, Z, Z. Also, we can mention that the Zayin is the number 7, especially in later Hebrew. So Genesis 7 would have been Bereshit Zayin, Bereshit Zayin. That would have meant Genesis chapter 7. Again, it could have been used for numbers or anything else like that. Now, there is one thing I want to bring up here, and that is a few letters that, especially as you're just getting started here, will be very easy to confuse and mix up. Now, I do promise that the longer you spend reading and practicing Hebrew, the less these will be confusing. At this point, even for, say, myself, in these fonts, it's not at all confusing, though there are some fonts that are more difficult to tell. But especially in these more biblical fonts, I can easily recognize these, and so you too, with a little bit of practice, will be able to easily distinguish these. So I did want to bring them up just to help highlight some of the similarities and differences. So, of course, over here on the left is our Zayin, as you see. And as I mentioned, this top part is actually a part of the letter's sort of essential form, right? But in the middle here, we have that Vav or Wow letter. And technically, its sort of core essence is just a vertical line, and that's it. So this top part is a little bit more just because of the fancy style of writing here, the font. But as you can see, they're both very similar. And so it will be perhaps challenging for a little while for you to really kind of get the feel for those differences and remembering which is which. Now, another one that you could get mixed up with, especially with the Zayin, is the Dalet. The Dalet. And that's because, in some ways they're kind of similar, having this vertical piece and this top piece. But as you can notice, the Dalet has a much more pronounced and horizontal top, whereas the Zayin is technically a little bit more of a diagonal, even though it doesn't look like that here. And it's a little bit smaller. It's not quite as pronounced as the Dalet. So those are a few things just to keep an eye out, maybe make some notes on your piece of paper. I think it's helpful to kind of exaggerate some of those differences. So exaggerate this top part for the Dalet. Make sure it's nice and kind of diagonal for the Zayin. And maybe for the Vav, really just kind of make it a straight vertical line, at least in your notes, to help you just learn some of those key aspects that will help you down the road. Okay. Well, let's look at a few key words. So as I mentioned, we're going to be learning here our word for remembered, or he remembered. And that is zakar, 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 zakar. He remembered, he remembered. All right. Now another one here, which sounds the exact same, zakar, zakar. But you'll notice this is the word for a male. Now, not a man, but a male, when you're talking about like a male animal or a male person, right? So really specifying male as opposed to just a man, right? Now, you'll notice that these two words sound the same, but their vowels are actually just a little bit different. And we'll actually be learning about our vowels coming up shortly here in another lesson. So you'll notice that he remembered, the verb form, has these two vowels, whereas for the word for male, it's two vowels of the same type here. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about these vowels in another lesson. So try to just remember those very little differences here, very nuanced, but it could make a very big difference depending on the context. He remembered versus a male. All right. So our next word here is zavak, 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 zavak. And zavak is an important word because it means he sacrificed or slaughtered. And so in its generic sense, it can just mean like to slaughter an animal to eat it. But of course, in its more theological and oftentimes metaphorical, or maybe not metaphorical, but sometimes metaphorical, but it's more significant uses. It has this sacrifice kind of sense, meaning, something done at the temple or in relation to covering of sins and trying to reestablish a proper relationship with the Lord after having disobeyed him or broken the covenant that you had made with him. So a very important feature. It was also used in the sense of creating covenants. So they would sacrifice a animal, and that would kind of signify, again, the relationship of the covenant or the significance of it. All right, well, here's another one, and this is perhaps a more fun word. This is the word for gold, zahav, zahav, zahav. Now, I always encourage people to try and make little mnemonic devices to remember. And so for me, I always like to remember this by saying, I got to have the gold. I got zahav, the gold. So it's kind of a silly accent here, but zahav, got zahav, the gold, zahav. And perhaps you can think of a better one than me, but that's the one I've used to remember, zahav, got zahav, the gold. All right, here's another one. And this one is zarak, 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 zarak. And zarak is a verb meaning he or perhaps it shined, sometimes and often referring to the sunrise, to shine or to enlighten. Now, this might get a little bit confused with the previous word, zavak. Okay, now zavak means he sacrificed or slaughtered, zavak. And this one is zarak, with that R in the middle, zarak. So zavak, he slaughtered, he sacrificed. Zarak, he or it shined, as you see here. So it may be a good idea to make some flashcards and write out maybe a list of these words and put their definitions next to it and just practice these because these words and the number of the words are going to continue to keep adding up since we're going to be trying to do, a number of key words every lesson. So definitely don't get behind on those. Take advantage of these keywords because many of them are either very common words or very important words that we'll find throughout the Bible. Another interesting one, an important one, is this phrase or word zar, or oftentimes found as zara, especially in the book of Proverbs. So if you remember, the strange or foreign woman, sometimes called the adulterous woman, and given a few different terminologies here in the book of Proverbs, she is contrasted with woman wisdom, right? And so it's really this foreign woman is not so much just because she is foreign, but in the sense that she's an outsider, and probably more in the sense of outside of the covenant people, or outside of the covenant ways of the people of the Lord, people who obey the Lord, fear the Lord, walk in his ways. And so she ends up getting associated with the woman folly, as we find later in Proverbs chapter 9. And so there's kind of this interesting metaphorical literary play on ideas and words, so that this Zara, who's a foreigner, kind of gets associated with adultery and abandoning the ways of the Lord, also associated with folly. But then wisdom, chokmah, is kind of given this, again, sort of feminine mystique in Proverbs 1-9, and she's more affiliated with the ways and the law of the Lord. And so, the son in Proverbs 1-9 is meant to, or called to, love and cherish and to hold to wisdom, like he would a faithful and good woman, a good wife, perhaps, kind of like the Proverbs 31 woman, right? Hold on to her. She's a good one. She's a keeper. So was wisdom. And so it's kind of a bit of a play on words and ideas, again, to really just communicate the idea that the people, the son, were to walk in the ways of the Lord, which was wisdom, which was to fear the Lord, which was to keep and to be faithful to the Torah and the covenant of the Lord, which ultimately would lead to the knowledge of God, meaning a personal relationship with the Lord. So an interesting and really kind of key word in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, Zara. Okay, well, let's go ahead and read a couple verses here. So we're going to start with Genesis 1, verse 26. Again, one of those perhaps most famous verses in the whole Bible. Maybe Genesis 1:1 being one of the few that's more well known. So let's read it here. We have Va Yivra Elohim. Va Yivra Elohim. Vayivra Elohim. Vayivra Elohim. And so, as we learned in our previous lesson, this is our word and. Again, very, very common. So, and here's the word to create. If you notice, that bara word is actually what we saw in Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bara. So we see here also the word bara. And then, of course, Elohim, which hopefully you can remember this one, which means God. So, and God created. And God created et ha Adam be salmo. Et ha Adam Betzalmo. Et ha-Adam Betzalmo. All right, so if you remember, et is typically not translated in English. Again, it's just telling us really what's not the subject, what the subject is doing. So God created the man, or perhaps just mankind, humanity, in, be. Remember we learned that preposition, be, in, which can sometimes mean in, with, by, among, against. But here, probably in or perhaps with, in or with the Salmo, his image or likeness. Here, probably more in the sense of image. And then we have B'Tselem Elohim. B'Tselem Elohim. B'Tselem Elohim. B'Tselem Elohim. And so what do we have here? Well, we have, again, that same preposition. So in, with, by, among. So in or with the image of Elohim. In the image of Elohim. All right. And then the next part of the verse here, we have bara oto. Bara oto. Bara oto. Bara oto. And this, hopefully you can recognize that word again. That's that word bara, meaning to create. So he created him. So I'll highlight that little pronoun there again. This is very, very common, as you can see. It shows up in many of the verses. So he created him. And so who's the him? Adam, right? The man. And so at this point, it's kind of referring to the man or humanity collectively, right? So he created the man in his image. And then it goes on to clarify, or maybe we might say expand just a little bit. So then we see the words zakar, u nekeva, bara otam. Zakar u nekeva, bara otam. So what do we have here? Well, zakar, if you remember, is not the word to remember. Zakar is that word meaning a male. Now, it's actually not a very common word throughout the Hebrew Bible, but I did want to bring it up just because it is similar to the word zakar, meaning to remember. And so it is helpful just to distinguish them early on so that it doesn't become a frustration later on down the road. Okay, so this means a male. And then we have that and again, u. And then nekava is the word for a female. So male and female. Again, very specifically, male and female. Not in the sense of man and woman, but male and female. Again, trying to really distinguish that he created them as man or humanity as mankind, but also within man as a humankind, he distinguished a male and a female part or component or complement to one another, which we learn a little bit more about in Genesis 2, of course. And then we see bara. Again, we've seen that already twice in this verse. Bara means to create. He created otam. And in this case, it's actually them. So them plural, the male and the female. So this is a really interesting and profound verse in the Bible. I think, well, we definitely don't have time to talk about every aspect of it, but it is really kind of, we have to think about this in terms of the ancient world. So in the ancient world, it was very common for people to think of people as not equal, right? So they believed that kings were more divine and that the peasants were, just like trash, like literally of a different kind. They had hierarchy of nations and nationalities or people groups, right? So people tended to think that their people group was actually more divine than other people groups, and similar with male to female relationships, that it was typically thought that males were simply of a different kind than women and were in a sense maybe more divine or something, right? Or just greatly superior. And while there is an ordering that happens, especially as we see in Genesis 2, and roles that are given and held to and just natural. In Genesis 1, God is, in Moses writing this, is really kind of leveling the whole world, right? So that Israel didn't think of themselves more highly than they ought to, right? But that goes for the Egyptians and the Babylonians and whoever, right? In other words, everybody on earth was created equally in the image of God, meaning every single person has the same inherent value. And we might even say inherent purpose and command, right? Because this goes on to say that the Lord gave a command to the man and the woman to have dominion over the world and to rule it in the way that He would, right? With grace and mercy and love and honor and justice and righteousness, the way a true king, right? The Lord, the way He would rule as a king. And so humanity, Adam, as both Zakar and Nechava, together were to express God's rule over the world in their different ways, but still nonetheless with honor and righteousness and justice. And so again, we can try and ask a lot of questions of the Bible that it sometimes just simply doesn't answer. And this is one of those that in ancient times, it would have been really profound in perhaps ways that we might take for granted. And so much more that could be said on this verse, but let's go on to our next one in Psalm 105, verse 8. So in this one, we do see our word zakar, meaning to remember. So we have zakar le olam berito. Zakar le olam berito. Zakar le'olam berito. All right. So what do we have here? Well, Zakar, as we remember, means he remembered. So he remembered le'olam, forever, berito. Now, I didn't say burrito. Sorry if that made you hungry. This is berito. So the root word is berit. Do you remember that one? We learned that when we talked about the bet. This is our word for covenant. One of those very, very important key words throughout the Bible. And so his covenant, meaning the Lord. So the Lord remembers His covenant forever. And then the second part of this verse, davar, siva le'elef dor. Davar, siva le'elef dor. Davar, siva le'elef dor. And so we have here davar, which is our word for word. Hopefully you remember that one as well when we talked about the letter Dalet. Davar. So the word, siva, which means to command, which is related to that word mitzvah, which means a commandment, or mitzvot. Very, very common in especially Deuteronomy and Proverbs. So the word He commanded, le'elef, meaning for 1,000. Elef means 1,000. And then dor. And we learned that one as well. What does dor mean? Dor means generation. So 2 or 4, 1,000 generations. So the word He commanded for 1,000 generations. So again, the Lord remembers His covenant forever. The word which He commanded to 1,000 generations. So in other words, God doesn't forget, God is faithful, and he is worthy of praise and worthy of our trust and our faith and our honor, because he will hold fast to those things that he promised. And of course, he promised even Adam and Eve back in the garden, those many, 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 many years ago, that the enemy, that the snake, that the serpent would not prevail, but that he would send someone, a Messiah, who would conquer that ancient serpent and crush him under his heel and defeat death once and for all. And for those who trust in his Messiah, those who are united with him, they are ultimately saying that they trust in the covenant and the word of the Lord, one that he has given to us, to his people, forever and ever. And he will never break it. He is bringing all of human history towards that one great goal, his salvation, which will be realized in the last days, on the day of its full revelation when Christ returns. So that wraps us up for the letter Zayin. So as we normally do here, let's go ahead and finish with a alphabet review. So we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Chaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sadek, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that wraps us up for our seventh letter, the letter Zayin. I hope you will remember it, and I hope that you learned a little something that you can share with somebody else. And we'll see you next time.